Hey, class. This is Coach Barrowline again. We're going to be taking our next step in American history. You know, we've just studied the passage and the ratification of the proposal and ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Now we're going to talk about the government and how it works in the years after the Constitution. So the first president, obviously, as you all know, is George Washington. He is elected in February of 1789. John Adams, who was the runner-up in the balloting, becomes the vice president. So Congress very quickly creates the first executive departments. The first three are State, Department of State, Department of Treasury, and the Department of War. And the cabinet, or the secretaries that supervise and run those departments, are known as the president's cabinet. And the President Washington's first cabinet is an all-star team. You have Thomas Jefferson, who will go on to become president himself. He's Secretary of State. Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who was probably maybe the smartest guy in the colonies at that time, and the Secretary of War Henry Knox, who was a famous general from the Revolution. So very quickly, politics in America divides into two camps. You have the Federalists on one side, led by Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a strong, robust central government. And then you had the Jeffersonian Republics, who grew out of the old anti-federalists. And Jefferson and Madison were the leaders of this group, and they wanted a smaller central government with a more rural base of population, and with the states having most of the power. So the first Congress only actually has 10 states in it. It takes some time for all the states to agree to the Constitution. So they sent proposed amendments to those states, which become known as the Bill of Rights. And in the Judiciary Act of 1789, they also organized the judicial branch. Originally, the Supreme Court had six justices. You had the Chief Justice and 5 associate justices. And John Jay, who obviously whose name you know from writing many of the Federalist Papers, is named as the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So there's lots of problems facing the country. One of them is a national debt. Federal government, Hamilton believed, he put forth a plan to settle the debt, and he believed that the federal government should take all the debt from the states and have it on the central government, find ways to bring revenue to governments, taxes and tariffs and things of that nature, and also to establish a national bank to control credit and make loans to government. New taxes were passed in the tariff of 1789, which taxed imported goods. Then you had the excise tax passed in 1791, which taxed the production of liquor, sugar, snuff, carriages, things that would be considered luxury items. Hamilton compromised with Jefferson and James Madison, who were opposed to his economic plan. And what he did in return for Jefferson and Madison swinging their support behind the national bank, he supported moving the capital of the United States to the south, to what is now known District of Columbia. Washington actually chose the area itself, and a French designer by the name of Pierre L'Enfant planned the city. He designed it. So the National Bank is incredibly controversial, and there are two basically views of the Constitution that emerged during this time. Strict constructionists believe that the government should do only what the Constitution says it can do. So that would be the Democratic Republicans. And then the loose constructionists believe that government can take reasonable actions that aren't specifically outlawed as long as they aren't specifically outlined, as long as they're not specifically prohibited by the Constitution. So one says, the strict constructionists say you can't do that, the Constitution doesn't say you can. The loose constructionists might say, well, we can do that because the Constitution doesn't say we can't. So it's two different views of the Constitution. Hamilton pointed to the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution when he proposed a national bank. And the necessary and proper clause basically gives Congress the authority to pass all laws necessary and proper for the conduct of our government. So it becomes a huge, one of the first big controversies in this new American system. So the idea of this construction, necessary and proper clause, is a good example of loose construction. So Jefferson didn't like the Constitution very much in its final form. He was gone to Paris most of the time it was being debated, and he favored a smaller national government. He was a strict constructionist, and he believed that Hamilton's interpretation of the necessary and proper clause was going beyond the powers granted to the government in the Constitution. Jefferson also opposed the National Bank. However, he agreed to not oppose it publicly in return for the capital being moved to what was then part of Virginia, now we know as Washington, D.C. So Congress passed the bill, and Washington signed it to charter the first bank of the United States in 1791. Almost immediately after the government's formed, you have disruptions that lead to the formation of the first political parties. Excise tax, for instance, led to a violent clash between supporters and opponents of a strong government. This becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Settlers in the western frontier feel that their interests were ignored, and Pennsylvania farmers specifically depended upon selling their surplus grain or turning their surplus grain into whiskey to sell. So this excise tax hurt them. The uprising becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Farmers attacked tax collectors, burned barns of people who gave away the location of their stills. There was violence throughout the western frontier. And eventually a crowd of more than 2,000 angry farmers threatened to march on Pittsburgh and burn it down. There was even talk of setting up a separate nation, of seceding from the United States. So Washington gave orders to stop the rebellion. And actually, he and Hamilton themselves, the president and the secretary of Treasury, led a force of over 13,000 men into Pennsylvania to stop the rebellion. Farmers scattered in the face of the overwhelming force, and many were caught and arrested. 2 were convicted of treason, but ultimately they were pardoned by Washington as well. So as a result, Federalists tried to organize better to control these issues. They established local associations. They gave political offices and other favors to their supporters. The Jeffersonian Republicans also worked to influence elections by working together. So you had the beginnings of, like I said, the two-party system. The Jeffersonian Republicans are going to become known as the Democratic Republicans. All right, so these challenges that are going to continue to grow throughout the 1790s and put pressure on this kind of tenuous peace between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. So one of the problems was the French Revolution. French monarchy was overthrown. Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, and Spain all declared war on the revolutionary government in France. Democratic Republicans feared that if the French Revolution would fail, that Republican governments everywhere would fail. So Democratic Republicans wanted to support the French. However, Federalists thought that the French Revolution was just chaos, and they feared it. So France and Britain were both trying to draw the United States into the war on their sides, and Washington said, look, we need to remain neutral, and he issued the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. As a result, you had some controversy between the French and the British. But Edmund Gannett, the French ambassador to the United States, actually enlisted an American crew to fight on a French ship against the British. Washington demanded of the French that they replace Gannett because, again, we wanted to maintain neutrality. So basically, in 1794, the British began seizing American merchant ships because Americans were continuing to trade with France. And they claimed that the ships carried French goods or were sailing to a French port. American sailors were thrown into British prisons, and the British were also stirring up trouble amongst the Native American groups in the Northwest Territory. So we're having trouble with Britain on our Northwest borders and on the seas. So John Jay, then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is able to negotiate a treaty with the British that requires the British to pay for damages to American ships, that required the British to actually leave their forts in the Northwest Territory, and required the U.S. to pay the debts that it owed Great Britain, which were substantial. And separately, Thomas Pinckney negotiated a treaty with Spain that settled a lot of border disputes along the southern part of the United States with Spain at that time. So the conflicts in the Northwest Territory mostly had to do with the stirring up of native groups. In the 1790s, many Native American nations resisted increased white settlement. Little Turtle was the leader of a group of Miami, Shawnees, and Delawares that went against the army in the Northwest and was victorious. So the American Army returned in larger forces and began to build forts and bring in supplies. And this kind of sets up the procedure by which the United States is going to settle the rest of the West. Send in the army, build forts, towns follow, so on and so forth. Finally, in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, the American forces finally defeat Miami resistance against the army. They then signed the Treaty of Greenville, which requires the Miamis to give up large territories in Ohio, parts of Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. It does, however, recognize the Miami's claim to the land that they still had, at least temporarily. All right, so you had problems with the British. You also had problems with the French. And after the presidential election in 1796, Washington had retired, setting the precedent of 2 terms. Jefferson was a Democratic-Republican candidate. John Adams was the Federalist candidate. So Adams became president. He wasn't very fully supported. It was a very close election. And sectionalism, made it difficult for him to even have the loyalty of his own party. Southern Federalists, for instance, supported Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina rather than Adams. Jefferson came in second with 68 votes, so Jefferson became vice president. Very quickly, they start to disagree over policies. The XYZ affair happens when France attacks an American merchant ship, and French agents referred to as XYZ asked for bribes of American diplomats who went to France to negotiate an end to the seizure, a return of the ship and the crew. So as a result, Congress is outraged. They cut off trade with France, canceled wartime treaties, authorized the building of more warships, and allowed the U.S. Navy to capture French vessels at sea. So we're very close to war with France at this time. And this whole thing brings along a general resentment of foreigners, which leads to the passage of the Alien and Sedition Act. So the Alien Acts pretty much targeted foreigners that could be considered a threat. It was mostly towards French and Irish immigrants, most of whom didn't support the French. They were refugees, but it increased residency requirements for citizenship and required registration with the government. The Sedition Act focused on Democratic Republicans who were opposing and criticizing the president's policies on the French Revolution. Eventually, 9 editors of Democratic Republican newspapers were actually convicted and jailed under Sedition Acts. Jefferson and Madison were appalled and drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that would allow states to nullify the federal law. Only Virginia and Kentucky passed a resolution, but it was an important step. Nullification is something that comes up throughout American history from here on. And in the end, what happens is there's a deeper, more bitterly divided political atmosphere in the United States as a result. So we'll talk about how that carries on into election of 1800 in the next note. So we'll talk to you guys later. See you later. Bye.